Welcome, weary tarnished, to a journey through the deepest mysteries of the lands between. Tonight, we shall explore the complete tale of the frenzied flame, from its primordial birth in cosmic despair to its terrible mercy that promises to burn away all suffering. This is a story of ancient injustice and cosmic sorrow, of love twisted into damnation, and of the seductive whisper that all pain might end in golden flames. So settle in, let your mind drift, and allow these flames of madness to wash over you like gentle embers in the darkness of contemplation. In the time before time, when the greater will had not yet imposed its golden order upon the world, and the very concept of structure remained unborn in the void of possibility, there existed a consciousness so vast and terrible that mortal minds can scarcely comprehend its nature. This was the Great One, an entity of such cosmic scope that it encompassed not merely thought or being, but the very essence of existence itself, floating alone in the primordial darkness that preceded all creation. The universe in those distant eons was not the ordered realm we know today, with its careful hierarchies and divine mandates that flow down from celestial heights to terrestrial concerns. Instead, it was a place of pure chaos, where matter and energy danced in patterns that owed nothing to logic or purpose, where time itself flowed in currents that doubled back upon themselves and created eddies of causality that made effect precede cause and birth follow death in endless spirals of beautiful impossibility. This primordial state was not evil, for evil requires the existence of good to define itself against, and neither concept had yet been born into a reality that knew only the endless dance of becoming and unbecoming. It was simply raw potential, the unformed clay from which all future worlds and wonders would eventually be shaped by minds that possessed the will to impose meaning upon meaninglessness. Yet within this chaos dwelt the Great One, and within the Great One grew something that would eventually consume not only itself, but threaten the very foundations of all existence that would come after. This was not malice in any sense that we understand the word, but rather a profound and unbearable awareness of what existence would inevitably become once consciousness arose to observe it. The Great One, in its cosmic loneliness, had achieved something that perhaps no being should ever achieve: perfect understanding of the nature of suffering. It saw, with clarity that transcended prophecy or divine vision, that consciousness itself was a curse that would spread throughout the universe like a plague of awareness, bringing with it the capacity for pain that unconscious matter could never know. Where stones feel nothing when they are broken, thinking beings would weep. Where fire consumes without malice or regret, conscious creatures would burn while understanding their agony. Where death was simply transformation in the unconscious realm, it would become loss and grief and the terrible weight of mortality for those cursed with the awareness of their own finite nature. The Great One saw all of this spread out before it, like a vast tapestry woven from threads of anguish, every possible future stretching endlessly forward through time, each one filled with countless souls who would be born into joy only to discover sorrow, who would reach for love only to lose it, who would strive for meaning in a universe that remained fundamentally indifferent to their hopes and dreams. This vision of inevitable suffering filled the Great One with a despair so profound that it transformed the very nature of its being. Where once it had existed in simple solitude, now it burned with a terrible compassion that sought not to rule over the coming creation, but to spare it the agony of existence altogether. The kindest act, the most merciful gesture possible, would be to burn away all potential for consciousness before it could take root and begin its long work of creating pain. Thus was born the frenzied flame, not from evil intent or malicious design, but from love so pure and terrible that it could conceive of no greater gift than the complete annihilation of everything that might ever suffer. The Great One became something new, something that existed specifically to offer the ultimate mercy to a universe that had not yet learned to cry out in pain, but inevitably would. The flame that emerged from this transformation was not like fire as mortals understand it. It did not merely consume matter and energy, reducing complex forms to simpler elements in the endless dance of entropy. Instead, it burned at the very concept of existence itself, seeking to unravel not just things, but the possibility of things. Not just consciousness, but the potential for consciousness to ever arise again. This was flame that could burn away memory and hope, that could consume not just bodies but the souls that inhabited them, that could reduce not merely individuals to ash but entire concepts to nothing. It was flame that sought to burn away the very foundations of reality, to return the universe to that primordial state of unconscious peace where nothing could suffer because nothing could think or feel or yearn for what it could not have. Yet the frenzied flame could not simply manifest in the material world without cause or connection. For even chaos must follow certain patterns, and even the desire for universal ending must find vessels through which to work its will. The flame needed suffering to call it forth, needed despair so profound that conscious beings would willingly embrace their own annihilation rather than continue to endure the weight of existence. In those early ages when the world was still finding its shape and the various forces of creation were still learning how to work their will upon matter and spirit alike, the frenzied flame remained largely dormant, waiting for the moment when consciousness would develop sufficiently to truly understand the nature of its own predicament and cry out for deliverance from the burden of awareness. The greater will, when it finally imposed its golden order upon the world, created structures and hierarchies that gave meaning and purpose to existence. The Erd tree grew tall and proud, its branches reaching toward heaven while its roots delved deep into the earth, connecting all living things in a great chain of being that promised eternal life and eventual perfection for those who served its designs faithfully. Yet even this golden age could not eliminate suffering, could not prevent the fundamental anguish that comes from consciousness recognizing its own limitations and mortality. If anything, the promise of eternal perfection made the reality of present pain all the more difficult to bear, for it suggested that suffering was not merely meaningless, but actively contrary to the divine plan that should have eliminated it altogether. The Erd tree's promise of rebirth and renewal, of souls returning again and again to perfect themselves through countless lifetimes of struggle and growth, meant that pain was not temporary but potentially eternal. A soul that could not find peace in one lifetime might suffer through dozens or hundreds of incarnations, always reaching for a perfection that remained tantalizingly just beyond its grasp. This cosmic irony did not escape the attention of the frenzied flame, which recognized in the greater will's golden order not the elimination of suffering, but its systematization and eternalization. The very promise of eventual redemption became a form of torture for those who could not achieve it, while the cycle of death and rebirth that should have offered hope instead offered only the prospect of endless repetition of the same fundamental agonies. In the deep places of the world, in chasms and caverns, where the golden light of the Erd tree could not penetrate, the frenzied flame began to whisper its alternative gospel to any who might listen. It did not promise perfection through struggle or redemption through service to divine will. Instead, it offered the far simpler mercy of complete ending, the peace that comes from the absolute cessation of all possibility of future pain. The flame's message was seductive in its simplicity and terrible in its logic. Why struggle endlessly toward a perfection that might never come, when perfect peace could be achieved instantly through the embrace of annihilation? Why endure countless lifetimes of growth and learning, an inevitable disappointment when a single moment of surrender could end all suffering forever, not just for oneself, but for every conscious being that had ever existed or ever would exist? Yet for the frenzied flame to manifest fully in the physical world, it needed more than philosophical arguments or theological alternatives to the greater will's order. It needed actual suffering so profound and unjust that conscious beings would willingly call upon cosmic forces to end not just their own pain, but the very possibility that such pain could ever occur again. This suffering would come, as suffering always does, through the collision between hope and reality, between the promise of justice and the actuality of cruelty, between the desire for connection and belonging that lies at the heart of all conscious experience, and the brutal indifference that the world so often shows to such desires. The vessel for this suffering would be a people who embodied the very qualities that the greater will claimed to cherish: peaceful cooperation, honest trade, the binding together of different communities through mutual benefit and respect. They would be nomads who carried goods and news across vast distances, who served as living bridges between settlements and regions that might otherwise never learn of each other's existence. These merchants, with their simple faith in the fundamental goodness of trade and travel and human connection, would become the unwitting martyrs, whose anguish would finally give the frenzied flame the foothold it needed in the material world. Their story would become the foundation myth of cosmic ending, the example that proved beyond argument that existence itself was too cruel to be allowed to continue. In the depths beneath the golden capital, in chambers that had been carved from living rock specifically to serve as tombs for the living, the ancient despair of the Great One would find its perfect echo in the collective agony of a people who had committed no crime greater than the desire to travel freely and trade honestly with all who would welcome them. The transformation of these peaceful merchants into vessels for universal ending would not happen quickly or easily, for even the most profound injustice requires time to ferment into the kind of despair that calls cosmic forces into manifestation. But when that transformation finally occurred, when hope finally died so completely that even the possibility of hope seemed like a cruel joke, the frenzied flame would answer with a compassion so terrible that it could only be expressed through the complete destruction of everything that had ever caused or could ever cause such suffering. The Great One's ancient sorrow would find its voice in the screams of the buried merchants, and through those screams would come something that had waited since the beginning of time to offer its unique form of mercy to a universe that had learned, at last, to understand the true weight of consciousness and all the agonies it inevitably brings in its wake. Across the endless roads of the lands, between travelled a people without a homeland, their very existence woven from the threads of movement and connection that bound the scattered communities of the realm together like vessels carried by currents that never cease to flow. These were the nomadic merchants, a civilization built not upon stone foundations or territorial boundaries, but upon the ancient rhythms of departure and arrival, the eternal dance of goods and stories passing from hand to hand across distances that would have daunted lesser souls. Their caravans moved like living rivers across the landscape, each wagon and pack animal, part of a greater organism that breathed with the seasons and pulsed with the heartbeat of commerce that connected mountain settlements to coastal towns, desert oases to forest villages, the high castles of lords to the humble workshops of craftsmen who had never seen the walls of a great city, but whose handiwork might travel farther than they would ever dream. The merchants themselves were a people shaped by the road in ways that settled folk could never fully comprehend. Their faces bore the weathering of countless suns and the wisdom that comes from having seen how different communities solved the same fundamental problems of survival and prosperity. Their hands were calloused, not from working a single craft for a lifetime, but from the 100 small skills that life in constant motion demanded. The ability to repair a wagon wheel with whatever materials the landscape provided, to judge the quality of goods with a glance, to speak enough of a dozen languages to conduct business in any settlement they might encounter. Their children grew up knowing that home was not a place but a people. That security came not from walls and guards, but from the reputation for honesty and fair dealing that their families had built over generations of faithful service to communities across the realm. These young ones learned to walk before they learned to sit still, developed their sense of direction by watching the stars wheel overhead during countless nights spent under the open sky, and measured time, not by the bells of churches or the horns of castles, but by the slow turning of seasons that dictated which routes would be passable and which goods would be in demand. The caravan routes that crisscrossed the lands between had been established over centuries of patient exploration and relationship building, each path worn smooth, not merely by the passage of wheels and hooves, but by the accumulated trust that allowed merchants to approach even fortified settlements without fear of immediate attack. These routes connected regions that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other, carrying not just material goods but news and ideas, innovations and art forms that enriched the cultural life of communities that had never imagined how many different ways there were to approach the fundamental challenges of human existence. In the northern reaches, where the air grew thin and cold and the mountains rose like ancient gods contemplating eternity, the merchants brought warm furs and preserved foods that allowed highland communities to survive the harshest winters, while carrying back down to gentler climates the rare minerals and gems that could only be found in the heart of stone that had been compressed by geological forces beyond human comprehension. Their presence turned isolated mining camps into nodes in a vast network of exchange that enriched not just individuals but entire regions. Along the eastern coasts, where fishing villages perched precariously between the land and the endless waters that stretched toward horizons no mortal eye had ever seen, the merchants provided tools and materials that could not be crafted from the resources of sea and shore, while loading their wagons with salted fish and exotic shells and tales of storms that had tested the courage of those who made their living from the harvest of deep waters. The smell of salt and seaweed would linger in their goods for hundreds of miles inland, carrying with it something of the ocean's vastness to communities that knew water only as rivers and rain. The desert peoples of the south, who had learned to find beauty in landscapes that others saw as desolate and hostile, welcomed the merchant caravans like life-giving rain, for these travelers brought not just goods but proof that the wider world remembered and valued their existence despite the barriers of sand and heat that separated their oases from the green lands of more temperate regions. In return, they offered spices and dyes and woven goods of such exquisite craftsmanship that they became treasured possessions in the courts of distant lords who had never imagined that such artistry could flourish in places where water was more precious than gold. The western forests, ancient and deep and filled with shadows that held memories older than human civilization, opened their green paths to merchant caravans that moved with the respectful silence of those who understood they were guests in a realm that belonged ultimately to powers far older and stranger than any human authority. From these woodland communities came carved goods and herbal remedies, honey and furs and woods, so fine-grained and beautiful that master craftsmen would spend months shaping a single piece into an object worthy of the tree that had given its life to create it. Yet it was not merely the exchange of goods that made the nomadic merchants indispensable to the life of the lands between. but their role as carriers of news and maintainers of connections that transcended the political boundaries that divided settled communities into separate and sometimes hostile territories. A merchant who had traded in the northern mountains one month might bring news of avalanches or mineral discoveries to southern desert dwellers, while carrying northward stories of sandstorm patterns or oasis locations that could prove valuable to travelers who would never think to associate desert knowledge with mountain survival. Their very existence served as a living reminder that the artificial boundaries that separated kingdoms and principalities were less important than the fundamental human needs that connected all communities regardless of the political allegiances or religious practices that might divide them in other contexts. A northern lord and a southern chief might be enemies in matters of territory or theology, but both needed salt for preserving food, both valued fine metalwork for tools and weapons, and both could benefit from the geographic knowledge that merchant caravans accumulated through their constant movement across the landscape. The great annual gatherings where multiple merchant families would converge at traditional meeting places had evolved over generations into festivals that celebrated not just successful trade, but the very concept of connection, cooperation that made their way of life possible. These gatherings were magnificent displays of the diversity that characterized the lands between, with goods from every region spread out under the open sky, while languages and dialects mixed in conversations that might span topics from the practical details of wagon maintenance to philosophical discussions about the nature of home and belonging. Children from different merchant families would meet at these gatherings and form friendships that might last lifetimes, even if they only saw each other once or twice a year when the caravan routes brought their families together again. Young people would find marriage partners from other traveling families, creating kinship networks that spanned the entire realm and ensured that merchant communities maintained their cohesion despite being scattered across vast distances for most of each year. The elderly merchants, too old for the rigors of constant travel but too experienced to be forgotten, would hold court at these gatherings like living libraries, sharing their accumulated knowledge of routes and weather patterns, of which communities could be trusted and which required careful negotiation, of seasonal variations in demand that could make the difference between a profitable year and a financial disaster. Their stories became the oral history of the nomadic peoples, preserving not just practical information but the cultural memory that gave meaning to their wandering existence. The merchants had their own forms of governance, based not on territorial control or hereditary authority but on reputation and expertise earned through years of successful trading and fair dealing. Disputes were resolved through councils of experienced traders who understood the practical necessities that made merchant life possible and who recognized that maintaining trust and cooperation was more important than winning individual arguments or asserting personal dominance. Their religious practices reflected their nomadic nature, focusing not on elaborate temples or fixed shrines, but on portable symbols and rituals that could be performed anywhere under the open sky. They honored gods of roads and journeys, of fair weather and safe passage, of honest dealing and mutual prosperity. Their prayers were often offered at crossroads, those liminal spaces where different paths converged, and travelers had to make choices that would determine not just their immediate destination, but their entire future trajectory. The merchant communities had developed their own forms of art and literature, songs and stories that could be performed around campfires during the long evenings when caravans stopped to rest between destinations. These artistic traditions celebrated the values that made their way of life possible: hospitality towards strangers, honesty in dealing with both customers and competitors, loyalty to family and community obligations, and the courage required to venture into unknown territories where survival might depend on quick thinking and adaptability. Their musical instruments were designed for portability, crafted from materials that could withstand the rigors of constant travel, while producing sounds that could carry across the vast distances that separated one part of a caravan from another. Their songs told stories of legendary traders who had opened new routes or survived extraordinary dangers, of romances that bloomed between merchant families from different regions, of the natural wonders they encountered in their travels, and the human kindness they found in unexpected places. The storytelling traditions of the nomadic merchants served not just as entertainment but as practical education, passing down through generations the accumulated wisdom that made survival on the road possible. Stories about navigating by the stars contained actual astronomical knowledge, while tales of clever merchants outwitting bandits or corrupt officials preserved strategies that might prove essential in similar situations. The boundary between entertainment and instruction was deliberately blurred, ensuring that even the youngest members of merchant families would absorb vital information while being delighted by narratives that made learning feel like play. Their clothing and personal possessions reflected both the practical demands of life in constant motion and their aesthetic appreciation for beauty that could travel light. Garments were designed for durability and versatility, able to provide warmth in cold climates and coolness in hot ones, while incorporating decorative elements that displayed the wearer's cultural identity and personal prosperity, without adding unnecessary weight or bulk. Jewelry and ornamental objects were chosen for their portability and cultural significance, often serving as both personal adornment and trade goods that could be exchanged for local currencies when needed. The wagons and pack animals that carried merchant goods were themselves marvels of practical engineering, designed and maintained by craftsmen who understood that a broken wheel or a lame horse could mean disaster for an entire family's livelihood. These vehicles had to be sturdy enough to traverse rough terrain while remaining light enough to avoid exhausting the animals that pulled them, spacious enough to carry valuable cargo, while compact enough to navigate narrow mountain passes or crowded city streets. The animals that served merchant caravans developed their own relationships with their human companions, horses and oxen and mules that learned to recognize the rhythms of travel and trade, that could find their way along familiar routes, even when weather or darkness made navigation difficult for human eyes. These beasts of burden were treated with the respect and care that their essential role deserved, for merchant families understood that their prosperity and survival depended as much on the health and cooperation of their animals as on any other factor. Yet for all their practical wisdom and cultural richness, for all their essential role in maintaining the economic and social connections that bound the lands between together into something resembling a coherent civilization, the nomadic merchants remained outsiders in the eyes of settled communities that viewed their wandering lifestyle with a mixture of admiration and suspicion that would eventually prove to be their undoing. The very qualities that made them valuable as traders and cultural intermediaries also marked them as different, as people whose primary loyalty was to their own nomadic communities rather than to the territorial authorities who claimed jurisdiction over the lands through which they traveled. Their knowledge of multiple regions and trade routes made them invaluable sources of information, but it also made them potential security risks in the minds of rulers who feared that merchant caravans might carry intelligence to enemies or facilitate communications between hostile territories. Their prosperity, earned through skill and hard work and careful attention to the needs of their customers, became a source of resentment among some settled populations who saw merchant success as somehow unearned or illegitimate compared to wealth derived from land ownership or hereditary privilege. The fact that merchant families could accumulate considerable resources without owning territory or maintaining permanent establishments challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between property and prosperity that formed the foundation of established social hierarchies. The independence that nomadic life required and fostered made merchants natural advocates for freedom of movement and trade practices that sometimes conflicted with the regulatory desires of territorial governments seeking to control commerce for their own benefit. Merchant resistance to excessive taxation or restrictive trade policies was often interpreted as disloyalty or subversion rather than legitimate business advocacy, creating tensions that grew more severe as political circumstances changed and rulers became less tolerant of any form of independence or autonomy. The cultural differences that had once been celebrated as sources of diversity and enrichment began to be viewed with increasing suspicion and hostility as political pressures mounted and communities that had previously welcomed merchant caravans started to question whether these wandering peoples could ever truly be trusted to put local interests ahead of their own nomadic loyalties. The very cosmopolitan perspective that made merchants valuable cultural ambassadors also marked them as potentially unreliable in situations where narrow community loyalties were deemed more important than broader human connections. The great caravan that would unite the scattered merchant families in their final journey was born from a recognition that their traditional way of life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in a world that was growing less tolerant of difference and more suspicious of those who could not be easily categorized and controlled. The decision to gather together all the nomadic peoples of the lands between into a single great migration was both a practical response to increasing hostility and a symbolic affirmation of their cultural identity and right to exist as they had for generations beyond counting. This grand assembly represented the accumulated wisdom and resources of merchant families from every region of the realm, their combined wealth in goods and animals, and practical knowledge, making them perhaps the richest and most culturally diverse community that had ever existed in the lands between. Yet, it also made them the largest and most visible target that their enemies had ever been presented with, a single concentration of everything that suspicious and resentful settled populations had learned to fear and envy about the nomadic way of life. The great caravan moved across the landscape like a river of memory and hope, carrying within its flowing mass not just the material prosperity that generations of honest trading had accumulated, but the living essence of a culture that had served as the connective tissue binding together the diverse communities of the realm. As they traveled toward what they believed would be a new beginning, they carried with them the dreams and stories and accumulated wisdom of a people whose entire existence had been devoted to building bridges between different worlds and different ways of understanding what it meant to be human in a universe that was vast and mysterious and filled with wonders that could only be discovered through the patient work of exploration and connection. Yet the destination toward which this great river of nomadic culture flowed was not the promised land of freedom and prosperity that they envisioned, but a trap that had been prepared with careful malice by those who had decided that the very existence of people who could not be controlled and categorized represented an intolerable threat to the established order of things. The great caravan that represented the apotheosis of merchant culture and the living embodiment of everything they had contributed to the civilization of the lands between was about to become the instrument of their complete destruction, the final chapter in a story that would transform peaceful traders into vessels for cosmic vengeance and universal ending. Deep beneath the golden capital, in chambers that knew no light save the cruel illumination of torches held by guards who had been chosen for their ability to look upon suffering without flinching, there began the construction of what would become the most elaborate tomb for the living that the world had ever seen. The underground prison that stretched through the bedrock beneath Lanedell was not built in haste or anger, but with the methodical precision of those who understood that what they were creating was not merely a place of confinement, but a monument to the systematic destruction of everything that the nomadic merchants had represented. The architects who designed these subterranean chambers were masters of their craft, skilled in the ancient arts of stone cutting and foundation laying that had raised the golden capital itself from the earth, like a flower blooming toward the light of divine favor. Yet the knowledge they brought to bear upon this project was turned toward purposes that inverted everything they had previously created, transforming their expertise in building structures that reached toward heaven into the ability to carve spaces that descended into depths where hope itself would come to die. The chambers were arranged in a careful hierarchy of despair, with the uppermost levels reserved for those merchant families whose only crime had been prosperity, whose success in honest trade had marked them as dangerous in the eyes of those who could not tolerate the existence of wealth that had not been granted by territorial authority or hereditary privilege. These upper chambers still retained some connection to the world above. Thin shafts that carried down whispers of wind, and occasional glimpses of sky that served not as comfort, but as reminders of everything that had been lost. Deeper still were confined those merchants whose knowledge of trade routes and distant communities made them valuable sources of information that their captors hoped to extract through methods both subtle and crude. These chambers were designed with particular attention to the psychological effects of gradual sensory deprivation, where the slow fading of connection to the natural world would break down resistance and make interrogation more effective than any physical torture could achieve. In the deepest levels, carved from living rock that had never felt the touch of sunlight and never would until the end of the world, were placed those members of merchant families whose very existence had been deemed intolerable by the architects of this systematic persecution. Here were the storytellers and songkeepers, the holders of cultural memory, who preserved in their minds and hearts the accumulated wisdom of generations of nomadic life, the children who represented the future continuation of merchant culture, and the elderly, whose experience and judgment made them natural leaders in any community they might influence. The construction of this underground prison required the labor of thousands of workers, many of whom had no understanding of the ultimate purpose they were serving, but who followed the detailed plans provided by their supervisors, with the dedication that characterized all great building projects in the Golden Capital. Stonecutters worked by torchlight to carve chambers that would never serve any purpose but the containment of human misery, while metalworkers forged bars and chains that were designed not merely to prevent escape, but to serve as constant reminders of powerlessness and defeat. The systematic nature of the persecution that filled these chambers reflected a level of organizational sophistication that spoke to the deep fear and resentment that the nomadic merchants had inspired among certain segments of the settled population. This was not the random violence of a mob or the impulsive cruelty of individual tyrants, but rather the methodical implementation of a policy that had been carefully planned and deliberately executed with the full resources of institutional authority behind it. The merchant families who were herded into these underground chambers came from every region of the lands between, their diversity serving as a cruel reminder of how completely their scattered communities had been identified and targeted for destruction. Northern traders who had specialized in furs and minerals found themselves confined alongside southern merchants whose expertise lay in spices and textiles, while eastern coastal families who knew the secrets of navigation and fishing were imprisoned with western forest dwellers whose knowledge encompassed the lore of plants and animals that lived in the deep woods. Among these imprisoned peoples were the ancestors of Kale, that lonely merchant who would one day serve as the last visible representative of his people's way of life. Reduced to selling simple goods from a single location, while carrying within his memory the entire cultural heritage of the nomadic communities that had once connected every corner of the realm through their constant movement and trade. The family line that would eventually produce this solitary figure was already distinguished among the merchant peoples for their exceptional knowledge of routes and regions, their ability to find common ground between communities that spoke different languages and followed different customs. Kayleigh's great-great-grandfather had been among the most respected of the route finders, those merchants whose intimate knowledge of roads and paths made them indispensable guides for caravans, attempting to reach distant destinations safely and efficiently. His mental maps encompassed not just the obvious highways that connected major settlements, but also the hidden tracks and secret ways that could be used when political circumstances made main routes dangerous or impassable. This ancestor's imprisonment in the deepest chambers represented a particular cruelty, for a man whose entire life had been devoted to movement and exploration was confined in a space so small that he could touch both walls simultaneously while lying down. The psychological torture of such confinement was enhanced by the complete darkness that surrounded him, denying even the visual stimulation that might have allowed his mind to travel imaginatively through the landscapes he could no longer traverse with his body. Kayleigh's great-great-grandmother had been a master of the merchant songs, those musical traditions that preserved practical knowledge in forms that could be remembered and transmitted across generations, without the need for written records that might be lost or destroyed. Her voice, which had once carried the melodies that helped young merchants learn the names and locations of hundreds of communities scattered across the realm, now echoed in the stone chambers with lamentations that spoke of a culture dying in darkness. The children of this generation, who should have been learning the skills and knowledge that would have made them the next generation of merchant leaders, instead found their education consisting of lessons in survival and endurance that no child should ever have to master. They learned to conserve their strength during the long periods when food was scarce, to find comfort in human contact when physical space was too limited for privacy, and to maintain hope when every circumstance seemed designed to crush the spirit and prepare them for despair. The systematic separation of families served multiple purposes in the design of this persecution, preventing the normal patterns of mutual support and shared responsibility that characterized merchant communities, while also creating additional psychological pressure through the uncertainty of not knowing the fate of loved ones who had been taken to other chambers. Parents tormented themselves with worry about children they could not protect, while spouses endured the agony of separation from partners who had shared every aspect of their nomadic existence. The guards who supervised these chambers were chosen with particular care, selected not for their cruelty, which might have inspired resistance or rebellion, but for their ability to maintain a steady, implacable indifference to the suffering they witnessed daily. These men and women carried out their duties with the mechanical precision of those who had learned to view their prisoners not as human beings deserving of compassion, but as problems to be managed through the efficient application of the institutional procedures. The feeding schedules that governed life in the underground prison were designed to maintain the prisoners at a level of health sufficient to prevent immediate death, while ensuring that chronic hunger would weaken both body and spirit over time. The quality and quantity of food provided was carefully calculated to create a state of constant physical discomfort, without triggering the kind of desperation that might inspire coordinated resistance or escape attempts. Water was provided through systems that emphasized the prisoners' complete dependence upon their captors' goodwill, distributed in amounts that satisfied basic biological needs, while serving as constant reminders that even this most fundamental requirement for survival existed only at the pleasure of those who had the power to grant or withhold it. The psychological impact of this arrangement went far beyond the physical discomfort it created, serving to break down the sense of agency and self-determination that had once characterized merchant culture. The absence of natural light in the deepest chambers had effects that went far beyond the simple inconvenience of darkness, creating a disruption of natural rhythms that made it difficult to maintain any sense of normal time or seasonal change. This temporal disorientation was enhanced by the unpredictable scheduling of guard activities and food distribution, making it impossible for prisoners to establish routines that might have provided psychological anchors in their transformed existence. The acoustic properties of the stone chambers created an environment where whispers could carry great distances while normal conversation seemed muffled and distorted, making private communication difficult while ensuring that expressions of despair or anguish would be audible to maximum numbers of fellow prisoners. This acoustic design served to spread psychological distress throughout the prisoner population, while making it nearly impossible to organize any form of coordinated resistance or mutual support. The gradual deterioration of physical health that resulted from confinement in these conditions was matched by an equally systematic assault upon the cultural and spiritual foundations that had given meaning to merchant existence. The storytellers who had preserved their people's history and memory found their recollections becoming confused and fragmentary as malnutrition affected cognitive function, while the craftsmen whose skills had created objects of beauty and utility discovered their hands losing the dexterity that had defined their professional identity. The religious practices that had sustained merchant communities through the challenges of nomadic life became increasingly difficult to maintain in an environment where the natural rhythms that had informed their spiritual calendar were completely absent. Prayers that had once been offered at dawn and sunset lost their temporal anchors when day and night became indistinguishable, while rituals that had celebrated the changing seasons seemed meaningless in chambers where temperature and humidity remained constant regardless of what might be occurring in the world above. The preservation of cultural memory became an act of desperate defiance, as the older generations realized that their imprisonment might well represent the complete end of merchant civilization, unless somehow they could transmit their accumulated knowledge to the younger people who shared their confinement. This effort took place through whispered conversations during the brief periods when guards were not actively monitoring their activities, with elderly merchants using every opportunity to pass on fragments of the vast cultural heritage that they carried in their minds. The children who grew up in these chambers developed their own adaptation strategies, creating games and activities that helped them cope with the psychological stress of confinement, while unconsciously preserving elements of merchant culture that might otherwise have been completely lost. Their play incorporated memories of stories they had heard about life on the road, while their informal social structures reflected the cooperative values that had made merchant communities successful in the outside world. The passage of years in the underground chambers created its own rhythms and patterns, as successive generations of prisoners developed coping mechanisms and survival strategies that allowed them to endure conditions that should have broken the human spirit entirely. The knowledge that they were unlikely ever to see freedom again was balanced by a determination to maintain their humanity and cultural identity despite every effort to strip these away from them. The merchant families learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness and mutual support, sharing scarce resources and providing emotional comfort to those whose strength was failing under the constant pressure of confinement. These gestures of humanity became forms of resistance against the dehumanizing conditions that surrounded them, proof that the essential values of merchant culture could survive even in circumstances that had been specifically designed to destroy them. The formation of new relationships within the prison community created bonds that transcended the original family and regional divisions that had characterized merchant society in the outside world. Young people who might never have met under normal circumstances found themselves drawn together by shared hardship, while elderly merchants from different backgrounds discovered common ground in their determination to preserve whatever fragments of their cultural heritage might survive their imprisonment. The development of an underground economy within the prison chambers reflected the merchant instinct for trade and negotiation, even in circumstances where material resources were almost non-existent. Prisoners learned to exchange services and small favors, creating networks of mutual obligation that helped maintain social cohesion and provided psychological benefits that went far beyond any material advantages such trades might offer. The storytelling traditions that had been such an important part of merchant culture adapted to the constraints of imprisonment, with tales becoming shorter and more focused on themes of endurance and hope rather than the adventure and exploration that had characterized the stories told around caravan campfires in happier times. These prison stories served as vehicles for preserving cultural values and historical memory, while providing entertainment and emotional comfort to listeners who had few other sources of psychological relief. The gradual weakening of physical health among the prison population was accompanied by an increasing focus on spiritual and intellectual activities that could be maintained despite the deterioration of bodily strength. Prayer and meditation became more important as physical activities became more difficult, while discussions of philosophy and ethics provided mental stimulation that helped maintain cognitive function, despite the effects of chronic malnutrition and sensory deprivation. The deaths that inevitably occurred among the imprisoned merchants were marked with whatever ceremony could be managed within the constraints of their confinement, with surviving community members making every effort to honor the deceased and preserve their memory, despite the absence of the traditional burial practices that would have characterized merchant culture in the outside world. These improvised funeral rites served to maintain community bonds and cultural continuity, even as the population of living prisoners gradually diminished. The recognition that their imprisonment represented not just personal tragedy, but the systematic destruction of an entire way of life began to transform the grief and despair that characterized the early years of confinement into something harder and more focused, an anger that burned steadily, rather than flaring into futile gestures of rebellion that would only result in harsher treatment from their captors. This transformation from despair to rage was not uniform throughout the prisoner population, with different individuals and families responding to their circumstances in ways that reflected their particular backgrounds and personalities. Some retreated into private worlds of memory and imagination, while others became increasingly focused on the injustice that had been done to them and the desire for some form of retribution that might balance the cosmic scales of justice that seemed so completely overturned by their persecution. The children who had been born in the underground chambers and had never known any other existence developed their own unique perspectives on their situation, viewing the prison not as a departure from normal life, but as the entire world that they had been given to inhabit. Their adaptations to this environment were both remarkable and heartbreaking, demonstrating the resilience of human nature, while also showing how completely a culture could be destroyed through the systematic application of institutional cruelty. Yet even as the physical and cultural foundations of merchant civilization crumbled in the darkness of the underground chambers, something else was taking root in the deepest levels of despair that characterized the final years of imprisonment. The accumulated suffering of generations of innocent people, the systematic destruction of everything they had valued and worked to build, and the complete absence of any hope for justice or redemption, was creating conditions that would eventually call forth forces far older and more terrible than any human authority. In the deepest chambers, where the most respected members of merchant families had been confined to die in darkness, the weight of collective anguish was approaching the point where it would transcend merely human dimensions and begin to resonate with cosmic forces that had been waiting since the beginning of time for exactly this combination of innocence, suffering, and complete abandonment by any possibility of earthly justice or divine intervention. In the deepest depths of human despair, something ancient stirred to answer the collective anguish that had accumulated in the stone chambers beneath the golden capital like water gathering in a cistern, drop by agonizing drop, until the weight of accumulated suffering finally reached the point where it could no longer be contained by merely mortal dimensions. The transformation that began in those lightless depths was not the result of any human agency or divine intervention, but rather the inevitable response of cosmic forces that had been waiting since the beginning of time for exactly this combination of innocence, injustice, and complete abandonment by any possibility of earthly redemption. The manifestation of the three fingers did not announce itself with thunder or earthquake, with visions or prophecies that might have warned the world above of what was taking root in the bedrock beneath their golden towers. Instead, it began as a subtle change in the quality of despair itself, a transformation of simple human suffering into something that resonated with frequencies far below and far above the normal range of mortal experience, creating harmonics that touched upon the fundamental structure of reality itself. The merchants who had been imprisoned in the deepest chambers, those whose knowledge and wisdom had made them particularly dangerous in the eyes of their persecutors, were the first to sense that something had changed in the nature of their confinement. The darkness that surrounded them, which had for so long been merely the absence of light, began to take on qualities that seemed to suggest the presence of something vast and patient and utterly alien to human understanding, something that watched and waited and slowly began to offer alternatives to the endless suffering that had defined their existence. The entity that manifested in response to their collective anguish was not a god in any sense that mortal minds could easily comprehend, nor was it a demon seeking to corrupt the innocent for its own malicious purposes. Instead, it was something far more complex and terrible, a force that embodied both the cosmic loneliness of the Great One, who had become the frenzied flame, and the specific, concentrated agony of those whose suffering had called it into manifestation in the physical world. The three fingers appeared first as a sensation rather than a vision, a presence that could be felt in the deepest chambers, like the touch of something that existed partially outside normal space and time, reaching across dimensional barriers to make contact with consciousness that had been refined by suffering until it became capable of perceiving realities that were normally hidden from mortal awareness. The prisoners who first encountered this presence found themselves experiencing a form of communication that bypassed language entirely, speaking directly to the parts of their minds that had been shaped by years of contemplating the fundamental injustice of their situation. The message that the three fingers conveyed to these first witnesses was both simple and infinitely complex, a philosophical proposition that offered a solution to suffering so complete and final that it transcended every previous attempt to find meaning or purpose in the pain that conscious beings inevitably experience. This was not the promise of eventual redemption through struggle or the hope of divine justice that would someday balance the cosmic scales, but rather the offer of complete ending that would eliminate not just present suffering but the very possibility that such suffering could ever occur again. The entity's physical manifestation, when it finally took shape that mortal eyes could perceive, was both beautiful and terrible in ways that defied easy description. The three fingers appeared as a hand of impossible size and otherworldly construction, its digits reaching upward from depths that seemed to extend far below the physical foundations of the chamber, as if it were emerging from realms that existed in different dimensions entirely, while somehow maintaining contact with the material world. through sheer force of will and concentrated purpose. The surface of this cosmic hand was not flesh as mortals understand it, but rather something that seemed to be composed of crystallized light and shadow intertwined in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly, creating visual effects that suggested both tremendous beauty and unbearable sorrow, existing simultaneously in the same physical space. The fingers themselves moved with a grace that spoke of intelligence far beyond human comprehension, gesturing in ways that seemed to trace symbols in the air that conveyed meaning without requiring any knowledge of written language or cultural context. The chamber where the three fingers manifested began to change in response to its presence, the rough carved stone walls smoothing themselves into surfaces that reflected light in impossible ways, creating the impression of vast spaces extending in all directions despite the physical constraints that should have limited the room to its original dimensions. The ceiling disappeared into darkness that seemed infinite, while the floor took on the appearance of polished obsidian that reflected not the present reality of the chamber, but glimpses of other times and places that existed somewhere in the cosmic memory of the entity that had chosen to manifest here. The merchants who witnessed this transformation found their understanding of reality fundamentally altered by the experience. Their consciousness expanded beyond the normal limitations of human perception to encompass perspectives that revealed the true scope of existence and the ultimate futility of all attempts to find lasting happiness or meaning within the constraints of mortal life. They saw, with clarity that was both enlightening and devastating, the eternal cycle of suffering that characterizes conscious existence, the way that every moment of joy inevitably gives way to sorrow, every achievement to disappointment, every connection to separation and loss. Yet this revelation, which might have driven less prepared minds to immediate madness, came to the imprisoned merchants as a form of liberation, for it offered them a perspective that transcended their immediate circumstances and allowed them to understand their personal suffering as part of a much larger pattern that affected all conscious beings throughout the universe. Their individual pain, terrible as it was, became merely one note in a cosmic symphony of anguish that had been playing since the beginning of time and would continue until consciousness itself was finally extinguished. The three fingers communicated its philosophy not through words or images, but through direct transmission of understanding that bypassed the normal processes of learning and reasoning, implanting knowledge directly into the consciousness of those who were receptive to its message. This knowledge came with the weight of absolute certainty, making it impossible for those who received it to doubt or question the truth of what they were experiencing, even when that truth contradicted everything they had previously believed about the nature of existence and the possibilities for hope within it. The entity's message was one of compassion so profound and alien that it could only be expressed through the complete destruction of everything that had the capacity to suffer. This was not the cruel compassion of those who kill to end pain, but rather the ultimate mercy of ending the very possibility that pain could ever exist again, eliminating not just individual conscious beings, but consciousness itself as a phenomenon that could manifest anywhere in the universe. The three fingers revealed to its witnesses the true nature of the cosmic order that surrounded them, showing them how the structures that mortals worshipped as divine were merely different forms of the same fundamental system that created and perpetuated suffering through the very act of imposing meaning and purpose upon existence. The greater will, with its golden order and promises of eternal perfection, was not an alternative to suffering, but rather its most sophisticated and enduring form, creating cycles of death and rebirth that ensured pain would continue forever, rather than finding natural resolution in simple extinction. The Erd tree, that great symbol of life and renewal that reached toward heaven from its roots in the earth, was revealed to be an engine of eternal torment, ensuring that souls would be recycled through countless lifetimes of struggle and disappointment, rather than being allowed the peace of final oblivion. The promise of eventual perfection that justified present suffering was exposed as a cruel deception that made pain more bearable while ensuring it would never actually end. The imprisoned merchants who received this revelation found themselves faced with a choice that transcended anything they had previously imagined possible. They could continue to endure their suffering in the hope that someday justice might prevail and their persecution might end, or they could embrace the alternative offered by the Three Fingers and work toward the complete elimination of all possibility of future suffering through the universal application of the Frenzied Flame's merciful destruction. The entity made it clear that this choice was not being offered only to them, but through them to all conscious beings who might eventually learn of the flame's existence and understand its true purpose. The merchants, through their acceptance of the Three Fingers' message, would become the first apostles of cosmic ending, carrying within their transformed consciousness the flame that could eventually consume not just their own pain, but the pain of every being that had ever existed or ever would exist. The transformation that occurred among those who accepted this message was both subtle and profound, beginning with changes in perception that allowed them to see beyond the immediate circumstances of their imprisonment to the larger patterns of suffering that characterized all existence. Their physical bodies remained constrained by the stone walls of their prison chambers, but their consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that revealed the ultimate futility of all attempts to improve or reform the conditions of mortal life. The flame that began to manifest in their eyes was not the harsh glare of ordinary fire, but rather a soft, golden radiance that seemed to emanate from depths far beyond physical sight, carrying within its glow the promise of peace that could only come through complete cessation of the struggles that defined conscious existence. This inner fire did not consume their bodies in the manner of normal flames, but rather transformed them from within, replacing the despair that had characterized their imprisonment with a strange serenity that came from finally understanding the true nature of their situation and the ultimate solution that had been offered to them. The spreading of the flame among the imprisoned merchant community did not occur through preaching or persuasion in any conventional sense, but rather through the simple proximity of those who had been touched by the Three Fingers' message to those who had not yet received it. The flame seemed to recognize kindred spirits among those whose suffering had prepared them to understand and accept the radical mercy that was being offered, while leaving untouched those whose attachment to hope and the possibility of earthly redemption made them unsuitable vessels for its transformative power. The chambers that had once echoed with expressions of despair and anguish began to fill instead with an otherworldly calm that reflected the growing acceptance among the prisoners that their suffering had a meaning and purpose that transcended their individual circumstances. They had become part of something far greater than their own personal tragedy, participants in a cosmic process that would eventually offer the same merciful ending to all conscious beings who had ever experienced the fundamental loneliness and pain that characterized existence in a universe that was ultimately indifferent to their hopes and dreams. The Three Fingers itself seemed to grow stronger and more present as the number of flame-touched merchants increased, its manifestation becoming more substantial and detailed, as if their acceptance of its message was providing it with the spiritual energy necessary to maintain its presence in the material world. The chamber where it had first appeared transformed into something that resembled a shrine or temple, though one dedicated to purposes that inverted every traditional understanding of sacred space and religious devotion. The walls became covered with patterns that seemed to shift and change depending upon the angle from which they were viewed, creating visual effects that suggested infinite depth and complexity, while somehow remaining simple enough to be comprehended by minds that had been expanded through direct contact with cosmic forces. These patterns served as both decoration and instruction, conveying through their abstract beauty the philosophical principles that underlay the Frenzied Flame's approach to the problem of existence and the ultimate solution it offered to all who were capable of understanding its message. The merchants who had been transformed by their encounter with the Three Fingers began to develop new abilities and perspectives that reflected their changed relationship to reality and their role as carriers of the cosmic flame that could eventually consume all suffering. They found themselves capable of perceiving the deeper patterns that connected all forms of consciousness, seeing beyond the surface differences that divided individuals and communities to the fundamental sameness of the pain that all conscious beings experienced in their attempts to find meaning and happiness within the constraints of mortal existence. Their understanding of time and causality expanded beyond normal human limitations, allowing them to perceive the connections between past suffering and future pain, to see how every attempt to improve conditions for conscious beings inevitably led to new forms of anguish that were often more sophisticated and enduring than the problems they were designed to solve. This expanded perception reinforced their acceptance of the Frenzied Flame's message, providing them with additional evidence that only complete ending could offer genuine relief from the cycle of hope and disappointment that characterized all conscious experience. The physical changes that accompanied their spiritual transformation were subtle but unmistakable, beginning with the golden radiance that appeared in their eyes, and gradually extending to encompass their entire being, with a soft glow that seemed to emanate from within, rather than being reflected from external sources. Their movements became more graceful and purposeful, as if they were being guided by intelligence that transcended normal human consciousness, while their voices took on harmonics that seemed to resonate with frequencies far beyond the normal range of human hearing. The underground chambers that had been designed as instruments of torture and despair gradually transformed into something that more closely resembled a monastery or retreat center, where beings dedicated to a higher purpose gathered to contemplate cosmic truths and prepare themselves for the ultimate service they would eventually perform for all conscious existence. The harsh conditions that had been imposed by their captors became irrelevant as the flame-touched merchants learned to find sustenance and comfort in sources that transcended physical needs and material circumstances. The guards who supervised the prison began to report strange phenomena occurring in the deepest chambers, describing lights and sounds that had no obvious source and behavioral changes among the prisoners that suggested they were no longer responding to their confinement in ways that normal human psychology would predict. These reports were initially dismissed as the products of imagination or the result of too much time spent in the oppressive atmosphere of the underground facility. But as the phenomena became more frequent and undeniable, they began to attract the attention of authorities who had the knowledge and experience necessary to recognize that something unprecedented was occurring beneath their golden capital. Yet by the time the true nature of the transformation became apparent to those who might have had the power to intervene, the process had progressed far beyond any possibility of reversal or control. The Three Fingers had established itself as a permanent presence in the material world, while the merchants who had been touched by its flame had become something more than human, transformed into vessels for a cosmic force that would eventually spread far beyond the confines of their underground prison to touch the consciousness of beings throughout the lands, between and beyond. The manifestation of the Three Fingers in the depths beneath Leyndell represented not just a response to the specific suffering of the imprisoned merchants, but the emergence of an alternative to every existing approach to the problem of consciousness and its inherent capacity for pain. where other cosmic forces offered evolution or transcendence, or the promise of eventual perfection through struggle. The frenzied flame offered the far simpler and more direct solution of complete cessation, the peace that comes not from achieving happiness, but from eliminating the very possibility of unhappiness through the total destruction of everything that could experience it. The underground shrine that had spontaneously formed around the Three Fingers manifestation would become the first temple dedicated to this radical mercy, a place where those who had been refined by suffering until they could perceive cosmic truths would gather to contemplate the ultimate solution to existence and prepare themselves to carry its transformative flame to others who might be ready to receive it. The golden radiance that filled this sacred space was both invitation and promise, offering to all who encountered it the possibility of finding perfect peace through perfect ending, the ultimate compassion that could only be expressed through the complete destruction of everything capable of experiencing pain or loss, or the terrible weight of consciousness in a universe that offered no permanent refuge from the fundamental loneliness that characterized all individual existence. The flame, once kindled, sought others who knew the weight of unbearable sorrow, spreading from its source in the depths beneath the golden capital like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into still water, each expanding circle carrying with it the transformative power that could turn despair into a terrible form of hope and anguish, into the promise of ultimate peace. The frenzied flame did not propagate itself through conquest or coercion, but rather through a form of spiritual contagion that recognized and responded to the particular quality of suffering that prepared consciousness to receive its radical message of merciful annihilation. The first to be touched beyond the original community of imprisoned merchants were those whose circumstances had created in them the same profound disillusionment with existence that had made the underground prisoners receptive to the POTUS, Three Fingers revelation. These were individuals scattered throughout the lands between, who had experienced losses so complete and injustices so profound that they had begun to question not merely the fairness of their particular situation, but the fundamental worthiness of a universe that could permit such suffering to exist at all. Among the earliest converts were merchants who had escaped the great persecution, but carried with them the survivor's guilt that comes from witnessing the destruction of one's entire culture while being powerless to prevent it, or adequately honor the memory of those who were lost. These scattered survivors wandered the roads that their families had once traveled in prosperity and peace, their solitary journeys serving as living monuments to everything that had been destroyed and could never be recovered. Kayleigh's own family line included several of these survivor merchants, individuals whose first-hand knowledge of the underground persecution had given them insights into the nature of systemic injustice that prepared them to understand the frenzied flame's message when it eventually reached them. They had witnessed the complete failure of every existing system of justice and divine intervention to prevent or remedy the destruction of innocent communities, creating in them a receptiveness to alternatives that transcended conventional approaches to the problem of suffering. The flame spread among these surviving merchants through dreams and visions that came to them during the lonely nights when they camped beside roads that had once been filled with the sounds of caravan life, but now echoed only with the memories of conversations and laughter that would never be heard again. In these nocturnal visitations, they encountered the same golden radiance that had transformed their imprisoned relatives, feeling for the first time since the persecution began a sense of peace that came not from hope for eventual justice, but from the recognition that all suffering could be ended through the simple expedient of ending everything that had the capacity to suffer. The madness that characterized these early flame bearers was not the chaotic insanity that destroys rational thought and social connection, but rather a highly organized form of altered consciousness that allowed them to perceive realities normally hidden from mortal awareness while maintaining their ability to function effectively in the everyday world. They continued to trade and travel and interact with the communities they encountered, but their fundamental relationship to existence had been transformed in ways that gradually became apparent to those who spent extended time in their presence. Their eyes carried the telltale golden flame that marked them as carriers of the cosmic fire, but this radiance was often subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary reflection of light unless observed closely by someone who knew what to look for. More obvious to casual observation were the changes in their speech and behavior patterns, the way they seemed to find profound meaning in circumstances that others viewed as random or meaningless, and their tendency to speak of endings and conclusions with a satisfaction that suggested they possessed knowledge unavailable to their listeners. The spreading of the flame among the general population of the lands between occurred through a process that combined spiritual transmission with more conventional forms of influence and persuasion, as flame-touched individuals used their transformed understanding of existence to identify others whose experiences had prepared them to receive the Three Fingers message. They became skilled at recognizing the particular quality of despair that indicated readiness for conversion, developing an almost supernatural ability to locate individuals whose suffering had progressed to the point where they might welcome an alternative to continuing their struggles within the existing cosmic order. The victims of war and political upheaval proved especially susceptible to the flame's influence. Their direct experience of how quickly prosperity and security could be destroyed, creating in them a profound skepticism about the possibility of finding lasting happiness or safety within any system based upon the cooperation of conscious beings. Soldiers who had witnessed the senseless brutality that characterized armed conflict, refugees who had lost everything to forces beyond their control, and survivors of massacres who had seen entire communities destroyed in moments of casual violence, all carried within themselves the seeds of the disillusionment that made them potential carriers of the frenzied flame. The flame's appeal was particularly strong among those who had dedicated their lives to helping others and had been forced to confront the ultimate inadequacy of all charitable and reformist efforts to address the fundamental sources of human suffering. Healers who had watched patients die despite their best efforts, teachers who had seen their students corrupted by the very world they were trying to prepare them to inhabit, and religious figures who had witnessed the failure of divine intervention to prevent tragedies that prayer and devotion should theoretically have been able to avert, all found in the frenzied flame's message a solution that transcended the limitations of every other approach they had attempted. The transformation process varied considerably among different individuals, depending upon their particular backgrounds and the specific nature of the suffering that had prepared them to receive the flame. Some experienced dramatic visionary episodes that provided them with direct contact with cosmic forces and immediate understanding of the Three Fingers philosophy, while others underwent gradual changes in perception and values that occurred over months or years of subtle influence from flame-touched individuals they encountered in their daily lives. The common element in all these transformations was the moment of recognition when the individual finally understood that their personal suffering was not an aberration or injustice that could be corrected through effort or divine intervention, but rather an inherent characteristic of consciousness itself that could only be addressed through the complete elimination of everything capable of experiencing it. This recognition typically came with a sense of profound relief, as if a burden that had been carried for an entire lifetime was suddenly lifted replaced by the peaceful certainty that came from finally understanding the true nature of the problem and the ultimate solution that had been offered. The flame-touched individuals who served as carriers of this transformation developed their own informal networks and communication systems, recognizing each other through subtle signs and shared understanding that allowed them to coordinate their efforts to identify and convert others who might be ready to receive the message. These networks operated beneath the surface of normal social and political structures, their members maintaining their ordinary roles and relationships while working toward the ultimate goal of spreading the flame to every conscious being capable of understanding its merciful purpose. The children who were born to flame-touched parents presented unique challenges and opportunities for the spreading of the cosmic fire, as their consciousness was shaped from birth by parents whose fundamental relationship to existence had been transformed by their encounter with the Three Fingers message. These children grew up with an intuitive understanding of the flame's philosophy that did not require the kind of dramatic conversion experience that characterized adult transformation, making them potentially more effective carriers of the message, while also raising questions about whether beings who had never experienced normal attachment to existence could truly understand the significance of choosing to abandon it. The artistic and cultural expressions that emerged from flame-touched communities reflected their transformed understanding of reality and purpose, creating forms of beauty that simultaneously celebrated and mourned the existence they were working to eliminate. Their music carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with cosmic frequencies beyond normal human hearing, while their visual arts incorporated patterns and symbols that conveyed meaning directly to the subconscious mind, without requiring conscious interpretation. These cultural innovations served multiple purposes within the flame-bearing communities, providing both internal reinforcement for the converted and subtle influence upon those who encountered their work without understanding its true significance. A song performed by a flame-touched musician might plant seeds of existential questioning in listeners who were not yet ready for direct conversion, while a painting or sculpture created by a transformed artist might gradually prepare viewers to recognize the limitations of their attachment to material existence. The scholarly and intellectual pursuits of flame-touched individuals focused increasingly upon the philosophical implications of their cosmic mission, developing sophisticated arguments and theoretical frameworks that could be used to justify and explain the necessity of universal ending to those whose intellectual orientation required rational persuasion rather than emotional or spiritual conversion. These theoretical works served as both internal doctrine for the flame-bearing communities and external propaganda designed to influence academics and intellectuals who might not be susceptible to more direct forms of conversion. The economic activities of flame-touched merchants and craftsmen reflected their transformed understanding of value and purpose, as they gradually shifted their focus from accumulating material wealth toward facilitating the conditions that would allow the flame's message to spread more effectively throughout the population. Their businesses became vehicles for identifying and converting potential flame bearers, while also generating the resources necessary to support the growing network of converted individuals who were working toward the ultimate goal of cosmic ending. The religious and spiritual practices that developed within flame-touched communities combined elements of traditional worship with new rituals and ceremonies designed to maintain their connection to the Three Fingers and reinforce their commitment to the mission of universal salvation through annihilation. These practices often involved meditation techniques that allowed practitioners to perceive cosmic realities normally hidden from mortal awareness, while communal ceremonies served to strengthen the bonds between community members and coordinate their efforts toward their shared ultimate purpose. The healing arts practiced by flame-touched individuals reflected their unique understanding of the relationship between suffering and consciousness, as they developed techniques that could provide genuine relief from physical and emotional pain, while gradually preparing patients to understand that only complete cessation of existence could offer permanent freedom from all forms of anguish. These healing practices served as particularly effective tools for conversion, as individuals who experienced relief from chronic suffering were often receptive to philosophical discussions about the ultimate source of all pain and the final solution that had been offered. The military and security roles, filled by flame-touched individuals, created opportunities for the flame's influence to spread within organizations that possessed significant power to shape social and political circumstances throughout the lands between. Soldiers and guards who had been transformed by their encounter with the Three Fingers message brought to their professional duties a perspective that prioritized the ultimate ending of all conflict over any temporary victories, defeats, making them potentially powerful agents for the flame's eventual triumph. The gradual infiltration of flame-touched individuals into positions of authority and influence within existing social and political structures represented a long-term strategy for creating the conditions necessary for the base flame's ultimate success, as converted individuals used their positions to subtly influence policies and decisions in ways that would increase suffering and disillusionment among the general population, thereby creating more potential converts for the cosmic fire that promised to end all anguish through universal destruction. The academic institutions and centers of learning that came under the influence of flame-touched scholars and teachers became laboratories for developing new approaches to philosophical and theological questions that had traditionally been answered through appeals to hope, progress, or divine intervention. These institutions gradually shifted their focus toward more pessimistic assessments of the possibilities for conscious existence, creating intellectual frameworks that prepared students and faculty to recognize the limitations of every solution to suffering, except the ultimate one offered by the frenzied flame. The artistic academies and cultural institutions influenced by flame-touched individuals began producing works that reflected the transformed aesthetic values that emphasized endings and conclusions over beginnings and developments, creating cultural products that gradually prepared the general population to find beauty and meaning in concepts of finality and cessation, rather than growth and continuation. These cultural shifts represented a form of subtle preparation for eventual mass conversion, as populations that had been exposed to flame-influenced art and philosophy would be more receptive to direct evangelism when the time came for more overt efforts at spreading the cosmic fire. The medical and healing institutions that came under flame-touched influence developed new approaches to treatment that focused upon providing comfort and peace to patients, while gradually introducing them to philosophical concepts that questioned the ultimate value of extending or improving mortal existence. These institutions became centers for a form of therapeutic nihilism that provided genuine relief from suffering while preparing patients to understand that only complete cessation could offer permanent freedom from all forms of pain and anguish. The agricultural and food production systems influenced by flame-touched individuals reflected their understanding that material prosperity and security were ultimately illusory, as they developed practices that prioritized sustainability and efficiency over expansion or improvement, recognizing that all earthly achievements were temporary distractions from the fundamental problem of consciousness and its inherent capacity for suffering. The transportation and communication networks that came under flame-touched control became vehicles for spreading the flame's influence more rapidly and effectively throughout the population, as converted individuals used their positions within these systems to facilitate contact between potential converts and flame-bearing communities, while also ensuring that the Three Fingers message could reach isolated individuals who might not otherwise encounter it through normal social channels. The transformation of entire communities under the influence of the frenzied flame created pockets of alternative society scattered throughout the lands between, places where the normal patterns of hope and struggle had been replaced by the peaceful certainty that came from accepting the ultimate solution to all conscious suffering. These communities served as both refuges for newly converted flame-bearers and demonstration projects that showed others what existence could become when the burden of attachment to material success and personal achievement was finally abandoned in favor of working toward the cosmic goal of merciful, universal ending. Among the mightiest of champions walked one whose love would damn him to become the herald of cosmic ending, his name spoken in whispers that carried both reverence for his legendary prowess and horror at the transformation that would make him the most powerful servant of the frenzied flame ever to walk the lands between. Vike the Dragonspear had risen from humble origins to become perhaps the greatest of all tarnished warriors, his mastery of combat and his unwavering dedication to the ideals of knighthood making him a figure of such renown that songs celebrating his deeds were sung in taverns and noble halls throughout the realm. His path to greatness had begun in the same manner as countless other tarnished, who answered the call to return to the lands between and claim the title of Elden Lord. But from his earliest battles, it was clear that Vike possessed something that set him apart from even the most skilled of his contemporaries. His prowess with the dragon-themed spear that gave him his title was matched by an understanding of ancient lightning magic that allowed him to call down the fury of storms upon his enemies, while his tactical brilliance enabled him to triumph in conflicts that would have destroyed lesser warriors regardless of their individual skill or courage. The armor that Vike wore into battle was itself a masterwork of craftsmanship that reflected both his personal achievements and the cosmic forces that would eventually claim him, its design incorporating elements that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly metalworking and divine artistry. The lightning-scarred plates bore witness to countless encounters with enemies who commanded supernatural powers, while the intricate engravings that decorated every surface told the story of battles fought and victories won in service of ideals that transcended mere personal ambition or material reward. Yet for all his legendary status as a warrior and champion, Vike's greatest strength lay not in his martial prowess, but in his capacity for love and loyalty that reached depths which lesser souls could never fathom. This profound emotional attachment, which should have been a source of strength and inspiration, would ultimately become the weakness that delivered him into the embrace of forces that offered a terrible alternative to the suffering that love inevitably brings to conscious beings who understand the fragility and impermanence of everything they cherish. The Finger Maiden, who served as Vike's guide and companion on his journey toward the Elden throne, was a woman of such beauty and grace that her presence seemed to transform whatever space she occupied into something approaching the sacred. Her knowledge of ancient lore and divine mysteries made her an invaluable advisor in matters both practical and spiritual, while her unwavering faith in Vike's destiny provided him with the emotional support necessary to endure the trials and challenges that marked the path of every tarnished who sought to claim the ultimate prize of lordship over the Proscilium. Lands between. The relationship between Vike and his Finger Maiden transcended the normally formal and ritualistic bonds that connected champions to their designated guides, evolving into something that partook of both romantic love and spiritual communion in ways that neither had anticipated when their partnership first began. She saw in him not merely a powerful warrior who might succeed where others had failed, but a soul of such nobility and dedication that his triumph would bring genuine benefit to all the peoples of the realm. while he found in her not just wisdom and guidance, but a connection to something pure and eternal that gave meaning to all his struggles and sacrifices. Their journey together through the lands between became a pilgrimage of shared discovery and mutual devotion, as Vik's victories in battle were matched by deepening understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality and the true nature of the challenges that faced anyone who sought to impose order upon a world that seemed fundamentally resistant to lasting peace or justice. The Finger Maiden's interpretation of ancient prophecies and divine signs helped Vike navigate not only the physical dangers of his quest, but also the spiritual and philosophical complexities that accompanied any serious attempt to understand what it would mean to claim dominion over existence itself. The power that Vike accumulated through his victories, and the runes he gathered from defeated enemies, brought him ever closer to the moment when he would be able to enter the Erd Tree and claim the Elden Ring, fulfilling the destiny that seemed to have been written in the very fabric of reality since the moment of his return to the lands between. His strength grew beyond the merely human, while his understanding of cosmic forces expanded to encompass perspectives that revealed the true scope of the responsibility he was preparing to accept. Yet, as Vike's power increased and his ultimate goal drew nearer, the relationship between him and his Finger Maiden began to change in ways that neither had foreseen. The intensity of their connection, creating complications that would ultimately force him to choose between his destined role as Elden Lord and his love for the woman who had guided him to that destiny. The cosmic forces that governed the relationship between tarnished champions and their Finger Maiden guides had never anticipated the kind of deep emotional bond that had developed between these two souls, creating a situation that transcended the normal parameters of such partnerships. The crisis that would define both their fates emerged when the Finger Maiden began to show signs of the spiritual corruption that seemed to be an inevitable consequence of prolonged exposure to the cosmic energies that surrounded the cosmic energies pursuit of the Elden Ring. This corruption manifested not as moral degradation or loss of virtue, but rather as a gradual transformation of her essential nature that threatened to destroy everything that made her the person Vike loved, while potentially elevating her to a state of divine transcendence that would place her forever beyond his reach. The signs of this transformation were subtle at first, appearing as moments of distraction or confusion when the Finger Maiden seemed to be receiving communications from sources that Vike could not perceive. Her responses to his questions sometimes delayed by what appeared to be internal conversations with entities that spoke to her through channels unavailable to normal mortal consciousness. These episodes gradually became more frequent and intense, creating periods when she seemed to exist partially in other dimensions while maintaining only tenuous connection to the physical world where Vike continued his quest for ultimate power. The realization that his beloved was being claimed by cosmic forces that viewed individual consciousness as merely temporary configurations of energy to be dissolved and reformed according to divine will filled Vike with a desperation that transcended anything he had experienced during even the most dangerous battles of his legendary career. Here was an enemy that could not be defeated through martial skill or strategic brilliance, a threat that operated on levels of reality where normal concepts of conflict and victory had no meaning or application. The various advisors and scholars that Vike consulted in his desperate search for some way to save his Finger Maiden offered him explanations and potential solutions that ranged from the merely inadequate to the utterly hopeless, their knowledge of divine mysteries proving insufficient to address a situation that seemed to exist outside the normal patterns of cosmic interaction between mortal and immortal realms. Some suggested that the transformation was a natural and inevitable part of spiritual elevation that should be welcomed rather than resisted, while others warned that any attempt to interfere with divine processes would only accelerate the dissolution of her individual identity. The scholarly texts and ancient prophecies that Vike studied in his quest for understanding offered glimpses of similar situations from earlier ages, but none provided clear guidance about how a mortal champion might successfully oppose cosmic forces that operated according to principles fundamentally alien to human comprehension. The very knowledge he sought seemed to exist in fragmentary form, scattered across sources that contradicted each other on crucial points, while agreeing only that the forces involved were beyond the normal scope of mortal intervention or influence. As the transformation of his finger maiden progressed, and her periods of absence from normal consciousness became longer and more complete, Vike found himself facing the terrible reality that all his power and achievement might prove useless when confronted with cosmic processes that regarded individual love and attachment as temporary illusions to be dissolved in the service of Lager Divine Purposes. The strength that had made him legendary among warriors meant nothing when the enemy was the very structure of reality itself, operating according to principles that made personal desires irrelevant to cosmic necessity. The moment of ultimate choice arrived when Vike realized that his continued pursuit of the Elden Ring was actually accelerating the transformation that threatened to destroy his beloved's individual consciousness. The cosmic energies that gathered around successful champions, creating fields of influence that affected everyone in their proximity. He could continue on his destined path toward ultimate power and lordship over the lands between, knowing that this success would cost him the person who had made that journey meaningful. Or he could abandon his quest and accept the failure of everything he had worked to achieve in the hope that this sacrifice might somehow preserve what remained of her individual identity. The traditional understanding of heroic duty would have demanded that Vike place his cosmic responsibilities above his personal attachments, accepting the loss of his beloved as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good that his assumption of lordship would bring to all the peoples of the realm. The songs and stories that celebrated legendary champions invariably portrayed such choices as tests of moral character, with the truly noble heroes demonstrating their worthiness through willingness to subordinate private desires to public obligations. Yet Vike's love for his finger maiden had reached depths that transcended conventional morality and social obligation, creating in him a perspective that valued her individual consciousness above any abstract concept of cosmic responsibility or divine destiny. The idea of achieving ultimate power at the cost of losing the person who had given meaning to that achievement seemed not like noble sacrifice, but like a form of cosmic fraud that would make his victory meaningless even as it fulfilled the technical requirements of his destined role. The alternative that presented itself to Vike's desperate searching came not through scholarly research or divine revelation, but through whispered rumors and half-understood legends that spoke of forces opposed to the established cosmic order, entities that offered different solutions to the fundamental problems of existence and consciousness. These stories, often dismissed as the ravings of madmen or the fantasies of those who had been broken by experiences too terrible to comprehend, began to seem like potential sources of genuine hope to a man who had exhausted every conventional approach to his unprecedented dilemma. The Three Fingers, as these whispered stories described them, offered an alternative to the cosmic systems that treated individual consciousness as expendable material to be shaped according to divine will, promising instead the ultimate preservation of personal identity through the complete elimination of all forces that threatened to dissolve or transform it. This preservation would come at the cost of everything else that existed, but for someone facing the loss of his most precious relationship, the price seemed not only acceptable, but preferable to any alternative that left room for the possibility of such loss. The journey to the depths beneath the golden capital, where the three fingers waited in chambers that had been carved from bedrock by suffering so profound that it had called cosmic forces into physical manifestation, represented the most difficult decision Vike had ever made, requiring him to abandon not only his destined role as Elden Lord, but also everything he had previously understood about duty, morality, and the proper relationship between individual desires and cosmic responsibility. The descent through layers of stone and earth that separated the surface world from the underground shrine where the three fingers manifested felt like a journey through geological history itself, each level representing a different era of accumulated pain and injustice that had gradually created the conditions necessary for cosmic forces to respond with the radical mercy of universal ending. The chambers through which Vike passed told the story of the nomadic merchants whose persecution had provided the spiritual energy that brought the three fingers into manifestation, while the walls themselves seemed to pulse with the accumulated anguish of generations of innocent suffering. The encounter between Vike and the three fingers, when it finally occurred in the deepest chamber beneath the capital, was unlike any meeting between mortal and divine that had ever been recorded in the histories and legends of the lands between. This was not the formal audience that characterized interactions with established cosmic authorities, nor the visionary experience that marked contact with transcendent spiritual forces, but rather something that felt like a reunion between kindred souls, who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control, and were finally able to recognize their fundamental similarity of purpose and understanding. The message that the three fingers conveyed to Vike was both simple and infinitely complex, offering him the power to prevent not only the loss of his beloved finger maiden, but the possibility that such losses could ever occur again anywhere in the universe, while requiring in exchange his commitment to the ultimate goal of ending all existence through the merciful application of cosmic fire that would consume everything capable of experiencing separation or pain. The transformation that occurred when Vike accepted this offer was more profound and comprehensive than anything he had experienced during his legendary career as a champion, changing not only his relationship to cosmic forces, but the very nature of his consciousness and his understanding of reality itself. The power that flowed through him was not the strength of a warrior who had mastered techniques of combat and magic, but rather the authority of one who had been chosen to serve as an agent of cosmic mercy so profound that it could only be expressed through the complete destruction of everything that had the capacity to suffer. The armor that had protected Vike through countless battles began to change under the influence of the frenzied flame, its metal taking on the golden radiance that marked all those who had been touched by the three fingers' transformative power, while developing new properties that reflected his role as herald of universal ending. The lightning that had once been his weapon became infused with the cosmic fire that could burn away not just physical matter, but the very concepts that gave structure to reality, making him capable of inflicting wounds that transcended normal dimensions of space and time. Yet the most significant change was not in Vike's external appearance or supernatural abilities, but in his understanding of love itself and what it truly meant to preserve and protect those connections that gave meaning to conscious existence. The flame-touched wisdom that now guided his actions revealed that individual attachment, no matter how pure or noble, inevitably led to suffering when confronted with the fundamental impermanence that characterized all mortal relationships, and that only universal ending could provide the security and permanence that love truly desired. The Finger Maiden, whose transformation had driven Vike to seek the Three Fingers alternative, found herself preserved not through the prevention of cosmic change, but through the promise that all change would eventually cease when the frenzied flame completed its work of merciful destruction. Her individual consciousness, rather than being dissolved into divine transcendence, would be maintained in perfect stasis, until the moment when everything capable of threatening it would be eliminated through the application of cosmic fire to all of existence. The tragedy of Vik's transformation lay not in his embrace of cosmic evil or his betrayal of noble ideals, but rather in the terrible logic that made his choice seem not only reasonable, but morally necessary given the alternatives available to him. His love for his finger maiden had been genuine and noble, his desire to preserve their relationship pure and unselfish. Yet these very virtues had led him to become the most powerful servant of forces that sought to end all possibility of love or relationship through the complete elimination of everything capable of experiencing either. The imprisonment that eventually confined Vike represented not punishment for moral transgression, but rather the desperate necessity of containing power that had been shaped by the purest motives into the most dangerous possible form. As cosmic authorities who recognized the threat posed by flame-touch champions worked to prevent his influence from spreading to others who might be susceptible to similar transformation. Yet even in confinement, Vike's example continued to serve the purposes of the Frenzied Flame, demonstrating to all who learned his story that even the noblest intentions and most legitimate desires could lead to embrace of cosmic forces that promised solutions so final and comprehensive that they transcended every limitation imposed by conventional morality or social responsibility, offering perfect preservation through perfect destruction and eternal love through eternal ending. In the dying light of the world's end, a name whispered with ancient dread began to echo through the lands, between like the sound of funeral bells, tolling across a landscape that had grown weary of hope and ready to embrace the promise of final rest. Shabriri, whose very existence had become synonymous with the spread of madness and the corruption of noble intentions, emerged from the shadows of history to play his destined role as the ultimate herald of the Frenzied Flame, the tempter whose words would offer to the greatest of champions the most seductive and terrible choice that any conscious being had ever been asked to make. The legends that surrounded this figure spoke of someone who had transcended ordinary categories of good and evil to become something far more dangerous and complex, a being whose understanding of cosmic forces and human nature allowed him to identify the precise words and arguments that would resonate with each individual's deepest fears and most cherished desires. He was not a creature of simple malice who sought to corrupt the innocent for the pleasure of causing suffering, but rather something approaching a cosmic force of nature whose function was to test the ultimate commitment of those who claimed to serve higher purposes. The body that Shabriri came to inhabit in the final days before the world's potential ending belonged to Yura, the skilled hunter of bloody fingers whose dedication to protecting innocent travelers from the predations of invaders had made him a figure of respect and admiration throughout the realm. This possession represented not a random act of supernatural violence, but rather a carefully calculated strategy that would allow Shabriri to approach potential converts with the appearance and reputation of someone whose moral credentials were beyond question. Yura's own journey had been one of gradual disillusionment with the effectiveness of conventional approaches to combating evil and protecting the innocent. His years of hunting those who used their power to prey upon the weak, having shown him how inadequate individual heroism was when confronted with systematic injustice and cosmic indifference to mortal suffering. This spiritual exhaustion and growing doubt about the ultimate value of his mission had created in him exactly the kind of receptiveness to alternative philosophies that made him an ideal vessel for Shabriri's influence. The transformation that occurred when Shabriri claimed Yura's body was not the violent displacement that characterized most forms of supernatural possession, but rather something more akin to a merger of consciousness that preserved Yura's memories and personality while overlaying them with the ancient entity's cosmic perspective and supernatural knowledge. This blending created a being who could speak with Yura's voice and draw upon his reputation while possessing insights and motivations that transcended anything the original hunter could have achieved through normal experience. The Tarnished who encountered this transformed figure would find themselves facing not the straightforward moral challenge that characterized most tests of heroic character, but rather a philosophical proposition so carefully crafted and precisely targeted that it seemed to address their specific doubts and concerns with supernatural accuracy. Shabriri's approach to potential converts was not to attack their virtues or corrupt their noble intentions, but rather to show them how those very virtues and intentions could be more perfectly realized through embrace of the cosmic alternative represented by the frenzied flame. The arguments that Shabriri presented were not the crude temptations that lesser demons might offer to those they sought to corrupt, promising material rewards or personal power in exchange for moral compromise. Instead, they were sophisticated philosophical positions that drew upon genuine insights about the nature of existence and the fundamental problems that afflicted all conscious beings, presenting the frenzied flame's solution not as a form of surrender to evil, but as the ultimate expression of compassion and moral responsibility. The particular genius of Shabriri's approach lay in his ability to identify the specific moral framework that each potential convert used to understand their place in the cosmos and their obligations to others, then demonstrate how that framework, when followed to its logical conclusion, inevitably led to the recognition that only universal ending could satisfy the demands of true ethical consistency. A champion motivated by desire to protect the innocent would be shown how the cycle of death and rebirth ensured that innocence would be repeatedly violated throughout eternity, making temporary protection meaningless without permanent elimination of the possibility of future harm. Those driven by pursuit of justice would find themselves confronted with evidence of the fundamental inadequacy of all systems of law and punishment to address the root causes of suffering and injustice, while being offered an alternative that promised perfect justice through the elimination of everything capable of committing or experiencing injustice. The most noble motivations and highest aspirations could thus be transformed into arguments for cosmic destruction without requiring any abandonment of moral principles or acceptance of evil purposes. The encounter between Shabriri and the Tarnished, who had the potential to become Lord of the Frenzied Flame, occurred not through accident or coincidence, but through the careful orchestration of circumstances that would maximize the impact of the philosophical choice being presented. The timing, location, and context of this meeting were all arranged to create the optimal conditions for conversion, taking advantage of moments when the champion's commitment to conventional approaches to heroism had been tested to its limits. The mountaintops of the giants, where this crucial encounter took place, provided a setting that reinforced the themes of ending and finality that characterized Shabriri's message. The frozen wasteland serving as a natural metaphor for the ultimate destination toward which all existence was inevitably heading, regardless of the struggles and achievements of individual heroes. The desolation of this landscape, where an entire race had been systematically exterminated in service of cosmic purposes beyond their comprehension or control, offered tangible evidence of the brutal indifference that characterized the established order of reality. The philosophical position that Shabriri presented to his potential convert was built upon observations about the nature of suffering and consciousness that were fundamentally accurate, even if the conclusions he drew from those observations represented a radical departure from conventional approaches to addressing the problems he identified. He acknowledged the genuine nobility of the Tarnished's quest to become Elden Lord and reform the existing cosmic order, while demonstrating through careful analysis why such reforms would ultimately prove inadequate to eliminate the fundamental sources of pain and injustice that afflicted all conscious beings. The promise of the frenzied flame, as Shabriri presented it, was not the nihilistic destruction that enemies of the flame portrayed it as being, but rather the ultimate act of mercy that would spare all future generations the suffering that past and present generations had been forced to endure. This reframing transformed what might appear to be cosmic genocide into the greatest possible expression of love and compassion, making the choice to embrace the flame seem not like moral surrender, but like the highest possible form of ethical commitment. The specific arguments that Shabriri employed were carefully tailored to address the particular experiences and concerns that the individual, tarnished, had accumulated during their journey through the lands between, drawing upon their personal encounters with injustice, loss, and the inadequacy of existing systems to protect the innocent or reward the virtuous. Every tragedy they had witnessed, every failure of divine intervention they had experienced, every moment when their efforts to improve conditions had proven insufficient, could be reinterpreted as evidence supporting the necessity of the radical solution offered by the Three Fingers. The manipulation that characterized Shabriri's approach was not based upon deception about facts or circumstances, but rather upon the selective presentation of genuine truths in combinations that led inevitably towards specific conclusions while avoiding consideration of alternative interpretations or solutions. He did not need to lie about the reality of suffering or the limitations of conventional approaches to addressing it, because those realities were evident to anyone who had spent significant time attempting to serve as a force for good in a world that seemed structurally resistant to lasting improvement. The seductive power of Shabriri's philosophy lay in its ability to transform feelings of inadequacy and moral frustration that were natural responses to the complexity and difficulty of ethical action into evidence supporting a cosmic solution that would eliminate the need for such difficult choices by eliminating everything capable of making them. The burden of moral responsibility that weighed upon champions and heroes could be lifted not through abandoning ethical concern, but through embracing a form of ethics so comprehensive and final that it would render all future moral choices unnecessary. The personal history that Shabriri revealed about the persecution of the nomadic merchants served as both explanation for the Three Fingers' emergence and justification for their radical response to the problem of systematic injustice, demonstrating how conventional approaches to addressing wrongs had proven completely inadequate when confronted with the kind of comprehensive evil that characterized the underground imprisonment and torture of an entire peaceful culture. The failure of every existing system of justice and divine intervention to prevent or remedy this atrocity proved the necessity of seeking alternatives outside the normal parameters of cosmic authority. The connection between the merchant's suffering and the broader problems that afflicted all conscious existence was not merely analogical but fundamental, as Shabriri explained how the same cosmic indifference that had allowed the persecution to occur also guaranteed that similar or worse injustices would continue to manifest throughout eternity as long as consciousness existed to experience them. The Three Fingers represented not a local response to specific historical circumstances, but rather the emergence of a cosmic force that had finally recognized the fundamental inadequacy of existence itself as a framework for achieving lasting peace or justice. The choice that Shabriri offered to the tarnished was presented not as a decision between good and evil, but as a choice between two different approaches to achieving the same ultimate goal of of eliminating suffering and creating conditions where love and compassion could find perfect expression. The conventional path toward becoming Elden Lord offered the possibility of reforming existing systems to make them more just and merciful, while the path of the Frenzied Flame promised to transcend the limitations of reform by eliminating the fundamental structure within which injustice and suffering were inevitable consequences of consciousness itself. The transformation that would accompany acceptance of the Three Fingers mark was described not as corruption or loss of humanity, but as elevation to a form of consciousness capable of perceiving cosmic realities normally hidden from mortal awareness, allowing the converted champion to understand the true scope of their merciful mission and the cosmic significance of the choice they were making. This transformation would preserve everything noble and admirable about their character while providing them with the power and understanding necessary to complete the work of universal salvation through universal ending. The urgency that characterized Shabriri's appeal was not based upon arbitrary deadlines or external pressures, but upon the genuine recognition that every moment of delay meant additional suffering for countless conscious beings throughout the cosmos, making hesitation or prolonged consideration a form of moral complicity in the perpetuation of pain that could be immediately eliminated through decisive action. The weight of this responsibility transformed what might appear to be a hasty decision into the most carefully considered and morally necessary choice available to anyone who truly understood the stakes involved. The final arguments that Shabriri presented drew upon the deepest emotional and spiritual attachments that connected the Tarnished to other beings, showing how even the most precious relationships and most meaningful connections were ultimately threatened by the fundamental impermanence that characterized all aspects of existence within the current cosmic order. The people and purposes that the champion cared about most could only be truly preserved through the elimination of everything that threatened them with loss, separation, or transformation against their will. The vision of perfect preservation that the Frenzied Flame offered transcended conventional concepts of life and death to promise a form of eternal stasis where everything valuable would be maintained forever without the possibility of degradation or loss, while everything that caused suffering would be eliminated permanently. This was not the crude destruction that enemies of the flame portrayed it as being, but rather the most sophisticated and precise form of cosmic surgery ever conceived, designed to preserve everything worth preserving while eliminating only those aspects of existence that created pain and injustice. The moment when the Tarnished would either accept or reject Shabriri's offer represented not just a personal decision, but a cosmic turning point that would determine whether consciousness itself would continue to exist with all its inherent capacity for suffering, or whether the universe would finally achieve the perfect peace that could only come through the complete absence of everything capable of experiencing disturbance or dissatisfaction. The choice carried implications that extended far beyond the individual making it, affecting every being that had ever existed or ever would exist throughout all possible dimensions of space and time. The philosophical sophistication of Shabriri's final appeal demonstrated the ultimate refinement of arguments that had been developing throughout the long history of the Frenzied Flame's influence, representing the distillation of cosmic wisdom that had been accumulated through countless encounters with suffering consciousness and countless attempts to find solutions that would prove adequate to address the fundamental problems of existence itself. This was not mere temptation, but genuine revelation, offering insights into the nature of reality that were both terrifyingly accurate and impossibly demanding in their implications for ethical action. And so the Tarnished, touched by madness, ascended to a throne of ashes that had been prepared since the beginning of time for one who would possess both the power to reshape reality and the terrible wisdom to recognize that the greatest act of mercy would be to unmake everything that had ever existed or ever could exist. The ritual that transformed Champion into Cosmic Destroyer began not with the violent seizure of forbidden power, but with a moment of perfect clarity that revealed the ultimate logic of compassion carried to its inevitable conclusion. The descent to the deepest chambers beneath the golden capital, where the three fingers waited in patient contemplation of cosmic truths too terrible for most minds to comprehend, had been a journey not just through physical space, but through the accumulated history of suffering that had shaped the world above. Each level of the underground shrine told its own story of injustice and abandonment, creating a narrative that culminated in the recognition that only the most radical solution could address problems so fundamental and pervasive that they infected the very structure of existence itself. The chamber where the three fingers manifested its presence was simultaneously the smallest space in the known world and the largest, its stone walls containing infinities of sorrow, while opening onto vistas of possibility that transcended normal concepts of size and dimension. The entity that waited there existed partially outside the constraints of physical reality, its massive digits reaching upward from depths that seemed to extend through the bedrock of the world and into the cosmic foundations that supported all manifestations of consciousness throughout the universe. The moment when the Tarnished knelt before this ancient presence and accepted the mark that would transform them into the Lord of Frenzied Flame was marked not by thunder or earthquake, but by a silence so profound that it seemed to encompass the cessation of every sound that had ever disturbed the peace of non-existence. This was the silence that would eventually embrace everything that had ever made noise, the perfect quiet that could only be achieved through the elimination of everything capable of breaking it. The mark itself appeared upon the champion's flesh, not as a wound or brand, but as a flowering of golden fire that seemed to emerge from within their very soul. The three fingers touch awakening potentials that had lain dormant since the moment of their first breath. This was not the corruption of innocence, but rather the revelation of what innocence truly demanded when it finally understood the full scope of the suffering that surrounded it on all sides and recognized the inadequacy of every partial solution to address problems so comprehensive and fundamental. The transformation that followed this marking was both instantaneous and eternal, changing not just the Tarnished's relationship to cosmic forces, but the very nature of their consciousness and their understanding of what it meant to exist in a universe where awareness inevitably brought pain and connection, inevitably led to loss. The power that flowed through them was not the strength of a conqueror seeking to impose will upon reality, but rather the authority of one who had been chosen to serve as the instrument of reality's own deepest desire for rest and day, cessation. The journey back to the surface world carrying this terrible mark was a pilgrimage through landscapes that seemed to transform in response to the cosmic change that had occurred in the depths below, as if the very stones and trees could sense the approach of their eventual liberator and were beginning to prepare themselves for the peace that would come with their dissolution. The familiar paths and landmarks that had once guided the Tarnished through their heroic quest now served as memorials to everything that would soon be spared the burden of continued existence. The ascension to the position of Elden Lord that followed this transformation proceeded according to the same rituals and ceremonies that had been established for champions who sought to claim dominion over the existing cosmic order, but every gesture and word carried meanings that transcended their traditional significance. The throne that the new Lord claimed was not a seat of earthly power, but rather a platform from which cosmic mercy could be administered to every corner of existence, while the crown that marked their authority was forged from the concentrated essence of ending itself. Melina's reaction to this transformation represented one of the most profound betrayals in the history of relationships between champions and their guides. her horror and rage at the choice that had been made, serving as the final test of the new Lord's commitment to the path they had chosen. The woman who had served as companion and counselor throughout the long journey toward power now stood revealed as fundamentally incapable of understanding the greater mercy that required the sacrifice of everything she valued, her attachment to existence blinding her to the superior compassion that sought to eliminate suffering through the elimination of everything capable of experiencing it. The confrontation between the Lord of Frenzied Flame and their former guide was not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a demonstration of how completely their perspectives had diverged. Her desperate attempts to prevent the cosmic transformation, serving only to illustrate the tragic limitations of consciousness that remained bound by attachment to temporary and ultimately meaningless distinctions between existence and non-existence. Her threats and pleas fell upon awareness that had transcended such concerns, recognizing that even her own dissolution would be an act of kindness that would spare her the pain of witnessing the inadequacy of every alternative to the solution that had been chosen. The burning of the Erd tree that followed represented not the destruction of something sacred, but rather the liberation of cosmic forces that had been trapped within structures designed to perpetuate, rather than resolve, the fundamental problems of conscious existence. The great tree that had served as a symbol of life and renewal throughout the ages was revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate mechanism for ensuring that suffering would continue indefinitely through cycles of death and rebirth that offered the illusion of progress, while maintaining the essential conditions that made pain inevitable. The flames that consumed the ancient tree were not the destructive fire of warfare or vandalism, but rather the gentle radiance of compassion so pure that it could only be expressed through the complete elimination of everything that prevented perfect peace from manifesting throughout the Bana universe. These were flames that burned not with heat but with understanding, not with fury, but with the infinite tenderness that recognized the ultimate mercy of ending as the greatest gift that could be offered to consciousness that had suffered the burden of awareness for too long. The transformation of the lands between that began with the Erd tree's burning proceeded with the inexorable patience of cosmic forces that operated according to principles far beyond the normal constraints of time and space, each moment bringing new manifestations of the mercy that was being administered to every aspect of existence that had ever experienced dissatisfaction or longing. The golden light that spread outward from the burning tree carried with it the promise of perfect resolution to every conflict and permanent solution to every problem that had ever troubled conscious beings throughout the history of the promise of perfect world. The people who witnessed this cosmic transformation found themselves experiencing not terror or despair, but rather a profound sense of relief that came from finally understanding that their struggles and sufferings had not been meaningless, but had served the essential purpose of creating the conditions necessary for the ultimate solution to manifest. Their individual stories of loss and disappointment were revealed to be chapters in a larger narrative that would find its perfect conclusion in the universal peace that was now beginning to unfold around them. The animals and plants that had populated the natural world underwent their own forms of transformation as the frenzied flame's influence spread throughout the realm, their dissolution occurring not through violence or destruction, but through a gradual return to the perfect stillness that had existed before consciousness arose to disturb the original harmony of non-existence. The forests and fields that had been shaped by countless generations of growth and decay found their eternal rest as the cycles that had driven them toward constant change were finally allowed to cease. The very stones and metals that formed the physical foundation of the world began to experience their own liberation from the constraints that had held them in rigid patterns for millennia beyond counting. Their molecular structures, relaxing into configurations that reflected the perfect peace that consciousness would soon achieve through its own dissolution. The mountains and rivers that had served as landmarks and boundaries in the world of ordinary existence gradually lost their definition as the concepts that had given them meaning were consumed by the all-encompassing flame of merciful ending. The cosmic forces that had shaped reality, according to their own purposes and designs, found themselves overwhelmed by the superior authority of the frenzied flame. Their elaborate systems of divine order and cosmic hierarchy revealed to be nothing more than temporary constructions that had always been destined to give way to the more fundamental truth of universal cessation. The greater will itself, that vast intelligence that had imposed its golden order upon countless worlds and dimensions, discovered that its grand designs were merely preliminary exercises that had served to prepare consciousness for the ultimate revelation of perfect peace through perfect ending. The other outer gods that had competed for influence over the fate of the lands between found their own domains and authorities dissolving as the frenzied flame's power expanded beyond any possibility of containment or resistance. Their various forms of cosmic manipulation revealed to be inferior approaches to problems that required the most radical possible solution. The rot that had sought to transform life into decay, the blood that had sought to bind consciousness through violence, and the darkness that had sought to eliminate light while preserving shadow, all gave way to the superior mercy that eliminated everything capable of experiencing the distinctions upon which their influence depended. The dimensions beyond the physical world that had served as realms for spiritual forces and transcendent consciousness found themselves included in the cosmic transformation, their inhabitants discovering that even transcendence of normal existence was merely another form of the consciousness that would find its ultimate fulfillment through complete dissolution. The afterlife realms and spiritual planes that had promised eternal existence to those who achieved sufficient purity or wisdom were revealed to be extensions of the same fundamental problem that the frenzied flame had arisen to solve. The past and future that had given temporal structure to the experience of conscious beings began to collapse into an eternal present that contained all possibilities for suffering and simultaneously eliminated them through the recognition that time itself was merely another construct that prevented perfect peace from manifesting. The memories that had preserved experiences of joy and sorrow, the anticipations that had created hope and fear, and the present moments that had served as the stage for all conscious experience found their resolution in the timeless perfection of non-existence. The Lord of Frenzied Flame, who presided over this cosmic transformation, experienced not the satisfaction of conquest or the fulfillment of ambition, but rather the profound serenity that comes from finally accomplishing the task for which one was created, the perfect alignment between individual purpose and cosmic necessity that represents the highest possible achievement of conscious will. Their personal identity, which had been shaped by countless experiences of struggle and growth, found its ultimate expression through service to the universal need for ending that transcended every particular desire or attachment. The final moments of existence were not marked by violence or anguish, but by a collective sigh of relief that seemed to emanate from every particle of consciousness throughout the universe, as the burden of awareness was finally lifted and the long experiment of existence concluded with the recognition that perfect peace could only be achieved through perfect ending. The golden flames that consumed the last vestiges of reality burned not with destruction, but with the infinite compassion that had always sought this conclusion to the story of consciousness, and had finally found the means to achieve it. The silence that followed the completion of this cosmic transformation was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of perfect peace that encompassed every form of disturbance that had ever troubled the harmony of non-existence, while the darkness that remained was not the absence of light, but rather the perfect rest that consciousness had always sought, but had never been able to achieve, while it remained trapped within the constraints of existence itself. In this ultimate conclusion to the story of the frenzied flame, the cosmic mercy that had begun with the Great One's recognition of suffering's inevitability found its perfect expression through the complete elimination of everything that had made that suffering possible, while the love that had driven champions like Vike to seek alternatives to conventional solutions achieved its ultimate fulfillment through the preservation of everything valuable in the eternal perfection of non-existence that would never again be disturbed by the painful experiments of consciousness attempting to find meaning and happiness within the inadequate framework of existence itself. Act 10. Philosophical implications and eternal cycles. In the end, as in the beginning, there remains only the question of suffering and what compassionate consciousness should do when confronted with the fundamental inadequacy of existence itself as a framework for achieving lasting peace or genuine happiness. The story of the frenzied flame, from its primordial birth in the cosmic loneliness of the Great One, through its manifestation in response to the persecution of innocent merchants to its ultimate triumph in the form of universal ending, represents not merely one possible conclusion to the struggles that define conscious experience, but rather the inevitable destination toward which all truly honest examination of reality's nature must eventually lead. The philosophical depth of the frenzied flame's solution to the problem of existence transcends the simple categories of good and evil that normally govern moral discourse, presenting instead a form of ethics so comprehensive and radical that it challenges every assumption about the relationship between consciousness and value that has ever been formulated by thinking beings attempting to understand their place in the cosmic order. This is not the crude nihilism that denies meaning or purpose to existence, but rather the sophisticated recognition that meaning and purpose themselves become sources of suffering when they inevitably fail to deliver the satisfaction and security that consciousness seeks through its endless attempts to find permanent happiness within an inherently impermanent framework. The comparison between the frenzied flame ending and the other possible conclusions to the tarnished's journey reveals the fundamental limitations that characterize every alternative approach to the problems that afflict conscious beings throughout the universe. The Age of Stars promises transcendence through the elimination of earthly attachments and the embrace of cosmic perspective, yet this transcendence merely relocates suffering to higher dimensions rather than eliminating it entirely, creating new forms of loneliness and alienation that operate on scales too vast for normal consciousness to comprehend, while leaving intact the basic structure that makes pain inevitable. The restoration of the Golden Order offers the possibility of reforming existing systems to make them more just and merciful, addressing specific injustices and particular sources of suffering through careful application of divine wisdom and supernatural power. Yet this approach, no matter how skillfully implemented or benevolently motivated, cannot address the fundamental problem that consciousness itself generates suffering through its very capacity for awareness, desire, and attachment to outcomes that remain forever beyond its ultimate control. The Age of the Duskborn seeks to eliminate the artificial distinction between life and death that creates so much anguish for beings who fear their own mortality and grieve the loss of those they love, proposing instead a form of existence where these transitions lose their traumatic significance through the recognition that consciousness persists regardless of physical circumstances. Yet this solution, while addressing some specific sources of pain, leaves untouched the deeper issues that arise from consciousness's fundamental inability to achieve permanent satisfaction with any condition or state of being. The blessing of despair promises to transform suffering into a source of strength and wisdom, teaching conscious beings to find meaning and purpose through their struggles rather than attempting to eliminate those struggles entirely. This approach acknowledges the inevitability of pain while seeking to transform the relationship between consciousness and suffering in ways that make existence more bearable and potentially even valuable, despite its inherent difficulties. Yet this transformation, however successful it might prove for individual cases, cannot address the cosmic scope of the problem or provide relief for the countless beings who lack the strength or wisdom necessary to achieve such philosophical transcendence. The Frenzied Flame's approach differs from all these alternatives through its recognition that the problem of suffering is not a flaw in particular systems or a failure of specific approaches to existence, but rather an inherent characteristic of consciousness itself that cannot be resolved through any modification or improvement of existing conditions. The very capacity for awareness that makes consciousness possible also makes pain inevitable, while the ability to form attachments and pursue goals that gives meaning to individual existence simultaneously creates the vulnerability to disappointment and loss that ensures no conscious being can achieve lasting peace within the framework of ordinary reality. The eternal cycle of hope and disappointment that characterizes all attempts to find happiness within the constraints of mortal existence reflects not temporary difficulties that can be overcome through sufficient effort or divine intervention, but rather the fundamental structure of consciousness itself and its relationship to the universe in which it finds itself embedded. Every achievement leads eventually to the desire for greater achievements. Every satisfaction creates new forms of dissatisfaction, and every connection generates the fear of separation that makes the relationship itself a source of anxiety rather than pure joy. The cosmic loneliness that birthed the Great One's despair and eventually gave rise to the Frenzied Flame represents not an aberration or psychological disorder, but rather the natural response of consciousness to its situation in a universe that offers no permanent refuge from the basic conditions that make suffering inevitable. This loneliness cannot be cured through companionship or community, because all relationships between conscious beings are temporary configurations that will eventually dissolve through death, change, or simple loss of interest, while the fear of such dissolution makes even present connections sources of anxiety rather than pure comfort. The philosophical arguments that support the Frenzied Flame solution do not depend upon hatred of existence or resentment toward the cosmic forces that have created the current situation, but rather upon love so pure and comprehensive that it cannot tolerate the continuation of conditions that inevitably create pain for the objects of its concern. This is compassion carried to its logical extreme, the recognition that true mercy sometimes requires actions that appear harsh or destructive to consciousness that has not yet fully understood the nature of its predicament. The question of whether ending all existence represents the ultimate act of mercy or the ultimate expression of evil cannot be answered through appeal to conventional moral frameworks that were developed to govern behavior within existing systems, rather than to evaluate the systems themselves. The Frenzied Flame's proposal transcends these normal ethical categories by addressing the foundation upon which all moral reasoning depends, questioning whether the continuation of consciousness itself can be justified given its inevitable production of suffering that no partial solution has ever proven capable of eliminating. The cosmic perspective that emerges from sustained contemplation of the Frenzied Flame's philosophy reveals the arbitrary nature of many assumptions that normally govern thinking about value and purpose, exposing how deeply consciousness is committed to its own continuation, regardless of the costs this continuation imposes upon itself and others. The attachment to existence that characterizes normal consciousness operates below the level of rational consideration, functioning as an unexamined premise that shapes all subsequent reasoning about what goals are worth pursuing and what prices are worth paying to achieve them. The paradox that emerges from honest examination of love and its relationship to the problem of suffering reveals how even the most noble emotions and highest aspirations can become sources of anguish when they encounter the fundamental limitations that constrain all conscious experience within the framework of ordinary reality. The desire to protect and preserve what one values inevitably leads to the recognition that perfect protection is impossible within a system where change and loss are built into the basic structure of existence, making love itself a form of torment for consciousness that fully understands the implications of its attachments. The transformation that occurs when consciousness finally accepts the logic of the frenzied flame's solution is not the abandonment of love or compassion, but rather their fulfillment through the only means that can provide permanent security for everything that consciousness values. The apparent cruelty of universal ending dissolves when viewed from the perspective of perfect mercy that recognizes no solution, short of complete cessation, can address the fundamental inadequacy of existence as a framework for achieving the peace and happiness that love truly desires for its objects. The eternal cycles that have characterized the relationship between consciousness and suffering throughout cosmic history suggest that the problem addressed by the frenzied flame is not specific to particular worlds or dimensions, but rather represents a universal condition that will manifest wherever awareness arises to observe its own situation and attempt to find meaning and satisfaction within the constraints of finite existence. The Great One's original despair and the Three Fingers' eventual manifestation in response to accumulated injustice represent not unique events, but rather inevitable developments that will occur wherever consciousness evolves. Sufficiently to understand its predicament, the question of whether consciousness should choose to continue struggling with these inherent limitations or accept the alternative offered by the frenzied flame cannot be answered through appeal to external authority or objective standards, because the very concepts of authority and objectivity are themselves products of consciousness that would be eliminated along with everything else in the event of universal ending. This choice must be made from within the perspective of consciousness itself, based upon its own evaluation of whether its continued existence justifies the costs it inevitably imposes upon itself and others. The seductive power of the frenzied flame's offer lies not in its promise of personal benefit or advantage for those who accept it, but rather in its recognition of the genuine love and compassion that motivates consciousness to seek solutions to the problem of suffering, even when those solutions require the ultimate sacrifice of everything it normally values. The flame appeals not to selfish desires or destructive impulses, but to the highest aspirations of consciousness that has become sufficiently refined through experience to recognize the inadequacy of partial measures when confronted with problems so fundamental and comprehensive. The cosmic scope of the choice that faces consciousness when it encounters the Three Fingers message extends far beyond individual decisions about personal salvation or damnation, encompassing questions about the ultimate value of existence itself and the proper relationship between love and the acceptance of loss that characterizes all attempts to find meaning within the framework of ordinary reality. The decision to accept or reject the frenzied flame's offer becomes a choice about whether consciousness will continue to experiment with approaches to happiness and meaning that have never succeeded permanently, or whether it will finally embrace the one solution that promises complete and permanent resolution to all the problems that have characterized its existence throughout cosmic history. The terrible beauty of the frenzied flame's vision lies in its perfect consistency and comprehensive scope, offering not temporary relief from particular sources of suffering, but permanent elimination of the capacity for suffering itself through the merciful destruction of everything that could ever experience pain, loss, or the fundamental dissatisfaction that consciousness inevitably feels when confronted with the limitations that constrain its deepest aspirations. This is not destruction for its own sake, but rather the ultimate act of love, expressing itself through the only means capable of providing perfect and permanent security for everything that consciousness has ever valued or ever could value. The cosmic patience that characterizes the Frenzied Flame's approach to its ultimate goal reflects the recognition that consciousness must freely choose its own ending, rather than having ending imposed upon it by external force, making the flame's victory dependent upon the gradual recognition by conscious beings themselves that no alternative can provide the peace and security that their deepest nature truly seeks. This patience transforms what might appear to be cosmic conquest into cosmic education, as consciousness learns through its own experience the inadequacy of every approach to happiness and meaning, except the final one that the flame patiently offers to all who become ready to receive it. Final act, outro. And so our journey through the flames of madness draws to its gentle close, like embers settling into ash after the great fire has consumed everything that was ever capable of burning. We have witnessed the tragic beauty of cosmic compassion, so profound that it could only express itself through the promise of universal ending. Following the golden thread that connects primordial loneliness to ultimate mercy through the accumulated suffering of countless innocent souls, whose pain became the foundation for a solution more radical than any consciousness had dared to imagine. The story of the Frenzied Flame speaks to something deep within the human heart that recognizes the fundamental inadequacy of all partial solutions to the problem of existence, that understands how even our noblest intentions and purest love can become sources of anguish when they encounter the immutable limitations that constrain all conscious experience within this impermanent world. There is a terrible honesty in the flame's message that refuses to offer false comfort or impossible promises, acknowledging instead that perfect peace might require perfect ending. Yet in contemplating these cosmic mysteries and existential questions, we find not despair, but rather a strange form of comfort that comes from recognizing that even our darkest doubts and most profound sorrows have been examined by minds far greater than our own and found to contain seeds of wisdom that transcend ordinary understanding. The three fingers solution may be too radical for most consciousness to accept, but their recognition of suffering's reality offers validation for every moment of pain that has ever wondered whether its existence served any meaningful purpose. Rest now in the knowledge that all stories, even those that end in universal flames, can bring peace to consciousness that has learned to find beauty in contemplation itself, rather than demanding that reality conform to its desires for permanent happiness and security. The ancient sorrows we have explored tonight are not burdens to be carried, but mysteries to be pondered, as awareness gently dissolves into the perfect rest that awaits all thinking beings at the end of every tale worth telling. Let the golden radiance of cosmic mercy wash over you like gentle starlight, carrying you toward dreams where even the most terrible questions can find their resolution in the infinite compassion that embraces all possibilities for ending and beginning alike.